Imagine waking up on Christmas morning only to watch your child torn from your arms and sold like livestock. By nightfall, a fortune worth thousands would be nothing but smoke and twisted metal. This isn't fiction. This is the story of one woman who decided that if they could take everything from her, she would take everything from them. What happened next would haunt an entire county for generations. The date was December 25th, 1858. Deep within the sprawling tobacco plantations of central North Carolina, a business transaction was finalized that would ignite an inferno before another sunrise. The official records remain mysteriously incomplete, and many believe this incompleteness is no accident. The facts we've managed to uncover paint a chilling picture. An infant was purchased, a mother stood witness, and before the morning of December 26th arrived, one of the region's most affluent estates had been reduced to nothing but ashes and charred remains. The authorized investigation concluded that malfunctioning lanterns were responsible. But those who lived through that terrible night, the survivors who carried these memories to their graves, they whispered an entirely different narrative. Their story revolved around a woman they called Ruth, a sum paid in silver coins, and an inferno that burned with such ferocious intensity, it melted the iron entrance gates into grotesque shapes. The actual events of that Christmas evening have remained concealed for over a century and 60 years, hidden away in courthouse storage facilities and private family documents that were deliberately kept from the public eye. Before we continue unraveling Ruth's story and the catastrophic fire that obliterated the Harrove estate, if these buried historical accounts fascinate you the way they fascinate me, make sure to subscribe to my channel and activate those notification bells so you never miss another investigation into our forgotten past. I'm genuinely curious about where you're watching this from, so leave a comment telling me your state or city. Now, let's journey back to North Carolina in 1858 and reconstruct what genuinely occurred during that Christmas. The winter season of 1858 had brought unexpectedly moderate weather to the Piedmont region of North Carolina, where the Harrove estate occupied nearly 400 acres of exceptional tobacco-growing land. This property ranked among Randolph County's most ancient holdings, established in 1790, won by Colonel William Harrove, a Revolutionary War veteran who had been awarded the territory as recompense for his military service. The colonel had been a utilitarian man, not predisposed to sentimentality or ostentatious displays. His residence was built with thick walls and minimal window openings, specifically designed to deflect oppressive summer heat and penetrating winter cold. He had planted his first tobacco crop during the spring of 1792, using seeds he had transported from Virginia, and before that year's harvest season ended, he had produced profit. By the time his grandson Edmund Harrove inherited the property in 1852, it had transformed into a massive commercial operation featuring 3 tobacco storage barns, a primary dwelling with 12 rooms, a separate cooking structure, horse stables, a meat curing facility, a metalworking forge, a carpentry workshop, and residential quarters for the 43 enslaved individuals who cultivated the land. The estate generated nearly 20,000 pounds of tobacco annually, with most of it shipped to Richmond before continuing to European markets. Edmund Harrove had reached 34 years when he assumed ownership of the family property. He had received his education at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where he had studied legal practice but never entered the profession. Instead, he had returned home to supervise the family business operations. Within the county, his reputation was primarily as a businessman, secondarily as a plantation operator. His record-keeping was extraordinarily meticulous. Every bushel of tobacco, every tool, every financial transaction was documented in leather-bound ledger books that he secured in a locked cabinet within his office. These volumes represented his greatest pride. At any moment, He could state the estate's exact monetary value down to the smallest cent. His spouse was a woman named Caroline, the daughter of a Charleston merchant family. She had lived 28 years, possessed a pale and slender physique, with a nervous temperament that had worsened following the birth of their second son. She occupied most of her time in the upper floor chambers of the primary residence, reading novels and composing correspondence to her sisters in South Carolina. Her outdoor ventures were rare, and when she did go outside, she wore a wide, brimmed hat and gloves regardless of the season. Their two sons, William and James, had reached 7 and 5 years respectively. Their care was entrusted to an enslaved woman named Bess, who had been with the family since before Edmund's birth. Bess had lived 6 decades. Her hair had turned gray. Her posture had stooped, yet her mind remained sharp. She had raised Edmund and his 2 sisters, and now she was raising his sons. Her sleeping quarters consisted of a small room adjacent to the kitchen, positioned close enough to hear if the boys woke during the night. The estate's physical layout followed a grid pattern with the main house at its center. To the east stretched the tobacco fields covering nearly 200 acres. To the west lay the vegetable gardens, fruit orchards, and livestock pens. To the north stood the barns and workshops, and to the south, separated from the main house by a wide dirt road, sat the quarters consisting of 12 small cabins where the enslaved population lived. By all available accounts, Edmund Harrove was an ordinary man for his time period, not exceptionally cruel by contemporary standards, but certainly not kind. He didn't personally administer physical punishment to his workers. That responsibility fell to his overseer, a man named Cyrus Dalton. However, he didn't interfere when Dalton did so. He provided adequate food and clothing, but nothing beyond bare necessities. He allowed the enslaved people to maintain small gardens behind their cabins, and he gave them Christmas Day off from work. Yet he charged them for any supplies they needed beyond his standard provisions. He operated his estate the way he ran everything else in his life, with cold efficiency and constant attention to profit margins. Ruth had been born on the Harrove estate during the spring of 1834. Her mother Denina had arrived at the estate as a young woman during the 1820s, purchased from a trader in Fayetteville. Denina had worked in the main house as a cook, a position that carried certain status within the enslaved community. Her skill with bread and pastries was widely recognized, and Caroline Harrove had depended on her heavily, especially during the years when pregnancy prevented her from managing household affairs. Ruth had grown up in the main house, assisting her mother in the kitchen. She had learned to read by observing the Harrove children during their lessons, and she had learned to cook by standing at her mother's side, watching her knead dough and tend cooking pots. She was a quiet child, observant and careful, with her mother's dark eyes and quick hands. When Ruth reached 11 years, Denina contracted an illness accompanied by fever. The sickness appeared suddenly in midsummer, and within 3 days she had died. The doctor who examined her suggested typhoid as the likely cause, though he couldn't be certain. She was buried in the small cemetery behind the quarters in an unmarked grave beside approximately a dozen others. Following Denina's death, Ruth was reassigned to field work. She was too young to work the tobacco rose directly, so she was given lighter tasks like carrying water, pulling weeds, and gathering leaves after they'd been cut. By the time she was 14, she was working full days, bent over the rows from dawn until dusk, her hands permanently stained brown from tobacco resin. She was 17 when she met Samuel. Samuel had been born on a Virginia plantation and sold southward when he was 15. He'd been purchased by Edmund Harrove in 1850, along with 3 other men to work in the tobacco barns. He was tall and broad, shouldered with a quiet strength that made him well respected among fellow workers. His words were infrequent, but when he spoke, others listened. He noticed Ruth one Sunday afternoon during late summer of 1851. She was positioned beside the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, washing clothes. He had come down to the water to fill a bucket, and had seen her there, her sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth. He had said something he couldn't later recall, and she had looked up and smiled. Their marriage occurred during the spring of 1852, in the manner available to enslaved people. There was no legal ceremony, no official record. But on a Sunday evening in April, they stood together before the other residents of the quarters, and an elderly man named Jacob, who had been a preacher before being sold, spoke a few words over them. Afterward there was a small celebration. Someone had managed to obtain a chicken, and there was cornbread and greens, and someone played a fiddle. Samuel moved into Ruth's cabin, a single-room structure with a dirt floor and one window. They had a bed made from rough planks with a straw mattress, a table, 2 stools, and a fireplace. The accommodations were minimal, yet they belonged to them. For a while, life established a rhythm. They worked the fields during daylight hours, and in the evenings, they'd sit by the fire and talk. Samuel would carve small objects from wood, including spoons, bowls, and toys. Ruth would mend clothing or braid fabric strips into floor rugs. On Sundays, they'd walk down to the creek and sit by the water, watching the sun descend over the fields. Their daughter was born in March of 1857, on a cold, rainy night. Ruth had gone into labor in the afternoon, and by midnight, the baby had arrived. Samuel had stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. When the baby finally came, small and red-faced and crying, he'd wrapped her in a blanket and handed her to Ruth. Ruth had gazed down at the tiny face, the dark eyes blinking up at her, and she'd felt something shift inside her chest, a fierce protective love that was almost painful in its intensity. She named her Lily after the flowers that grew wild near the creek. Lily was a healthy baby, bright-eyed and quick to smile. She had Ruth's dark eyes and Samuel's broad forehead. By 6 months old, she was laughing and reaching for things, and by 1 year old, she was pulling herself up to stand, holding onto the table's edge. Ruth would carry her into the fields in a sling made from old cloth, setting her down in the shade while she worked the rows. In the evenings, she'd sing to her old songs Dinina had taught her, songs that had been passed down through generations, songs about rivers and roads and freedom. Samuel cherished the child. He'd carve little toys for her from wood scraps, mostly animals including a horse, a bird, and a rabbit. He'd make them move and dance, while Lily laughed and reached for them with her small hands. He'd speak to her in a soft voice, telling her stories about places he'd never been, places he'd only heard about from other people, places where the land was flat and wide, where you could walk for days and never see another person, places where people were free. For a brief time, despite everything, something resembling happiness existed within that small cabin in the quarters. But Edmund Hargrove's ledger books told a different story. The tobacco crop of 1857 had been poor. The late frost in April had damaged the seedlings, and then a dry summer had stunted growth. The plants had been small and weak, the leaves thin and brittle. The harvest brought in less than half of what Harrove had projected. By fall, he was in debt to a merchant in Greensboro, who'd extended him credit for seed and supplies. The merchant wanted payment. Harrove didn't have it. He'd spent the winter trying to figure out how to cover the debt. He'd considered selling some of the land, but property values were low, and he didn't want to break up the estate. He'd considered taking out a loan, but the banks were cautious about lending to planters after the panic of 1857, when several large estates in the region had gone bankrupt. In November, a man named Josiah Trent arrived at the estate. Trent was a human trafficker based out of Richmond, Virginia, but he traveled a circuit through North Carolina and South Carolina, buying and selling human beings the way other men bought and sold livestock. He was in his 40s, a large man with a thick beard and cold eyes. He wore expensive clothes including a wool coat, leather boots, and a gold watch chain. And he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew his business was profitable. He was known for paying cash, and he didn't ask too many questions. Harrove met with him in the study. The meeting lasted 2 hours. They sat across from each other at Harrove's desk, Trent with a ledger of his own listing the current prices for men, women, and children in various markets. Harrove with his own ledgers open, showing the names and ages of everyone on the estate. They negotiated. Trent was interested in young men, field hands who could be sold to plantations further south, where the cotton industry was booming. Harrove was reluctant to sell his best workers, but he needed the money. They settled on 3 men, all in their 20s, all strong and healthy. Trent would pay $800 each, but that wasn't enough to cover the debt. Trent leaned back in his chair and looked at the ledger again. "You got any children?" he asked. Harrove hesitated. "A few light-skinned ones." Harrove nodded slowly. Trent smiled. "Light-skinned children fetch a good price in Richmond, especially girls. People like to buy them young, raise them in the house, teach them to sew, cook, clean. They're easier to train when they're young." Harrove didn't say anything. "I'll give you $200 for a healthy child," Trent said. $250 if she's particularly light." Harrove looked down at his ledger. He ran his finger down the list of names until he found what he was looking for. "Lily," he said, "born March 1857, daughter of Ruth and Samuel." Trent made a note in his own ledger. "I'll take her." When Trent left, he had a list of names, 4 people comprising 3 men and 1 child. Ruth's name wasn't on it, but Lily's was. Christmas Day 1858 began like most winter mornings on the estate, cold and gray with thin fog hanging over the fields. The temperature had dropped overnight, and there was frost on the ground crunching underfoot. The enslaved people had been given the day off from work, as was customary. It was one of the few days of the year when they didn't have to be in the fields at dawn. Some gathered in the quarters sharing what little food they'd managed to save or trade for. Others stayed in their cabins trying to keep warm. Ruth woke early. Lily was fussy, teething and feverish. She'd been up half the night crying and squirming, and Ruth had held her close, rocking her gently, singing softly. Samuel had gone to the main house before dawn. Harrove had called for him to help move some furniture in preparation for a small gathering he was hosting that evening. He'd promised to be back by midday. Ruth sat by the fire holding Lily in her lap. The baby was quieter now, her eyes half closed, her small fist wrapped around Ruth's finger. Ruth hummed softly, the same song her mother had sung to her when she was a child, a song about a river and a road in a place where the sun always shone. Around 10 in the morning, there was a knock on the cabin door. Ruth looked up. She knew immediately that something was wrong. Nobody knocked on Christmas morning. Nobody came to the cabins unless there was trouble. She stood slowly, still holding Lily. She crossed the small room and opened the door. It was Edmund Harrove, and behind him, Josiah Trent. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, instinctively pulling Lily closer. Harrove's face was expressionless. He didn't look at Ruth directly. He looked past her into the cabin as if he were inspecting it. "The child's been sold," he said. His voice was flat, businesslike. "Trent's taking her to Richmond this afternoon." Ruth's hands tightened around Lily. The baby squirmed, whimpering. "No," Ruth said. Her voice was barely a whisper. Harrove finally looked at her. His expression didn't change. "It's done. The papers are signed." Ruth shook her head. "Please, please. She's just a baby. She's not even 2 years old." Trent stepped forward. He was a large man, broad, shouldered with a face that showed no emotion. "Make it easy on yourself," he said. "Hand her over." Ruth backed toward the far wall of the cabin. "Please," she said again. "Please don't do this. She'll fetch a good price in Richmond," Trent said. "Light-skinned children always do. Someone will raise her in a house, teach her to sew or cook. She'll have a better life than she'd have here." "She's my daughter." Harrove's voice was cold. "She's my property, and I need the money." Ruth looked at him, really looked at him, at his expensive coat, his polished boots, his clean hands, at the gold watch chain hanging from his vest pocket, at the face that showed no trace of guilt or hesitation. "You're selling my baby on Christmas," she said. Her voice was shaking now. "On Christmas?" Harrove didn't respond. What happened next was over in less than a minute. Trent moved quickly, crossing the small cabin in 2 strides. He grabbed Lily from Ruth's arms, pulling her away with a practiced efficiency that suggested he'd done this many times before. The baby screamed, a high piercing wail that cut through the cold morning air. Ruth lunged forward, trying to grab Lily back, but Harrove caught her by the arm, holding her back. She fought, clawing at his hands, kicking, screaming, but he was stronger. He twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her to her knees. Trent was already out the door, Lily wailing in his arms. Ruth screamed. It was a sound that came from somewhere deep inside her, a sound of pure anguish. She screamed until her voice broke, until her throat was raw. Harrove released her and stepped back. She collapsed to the floor, sobbing. He looked down at her for a moment, his expression still cold and distant. "You'll get over it," he said. Then he turned and walked out, closing the door behind him. Ruth stayed on the floor, her body shaking with sobs. She could still hear Lily crying, the sound growing fainter as Trent carried her away. She could hear the creak of a wagon, the jingle of harness, the sound of horse hooves on the frozen ground. And then silence. By noon, Josiah Trent's wagon was gone, heading north toward Virginia. Lily was in the back, wrapped in a blanket, still crying. The 3 men Harrove had sold were chained in the wagon bed, their faces blank with shock and resignation. Ruth didn't move from the floor of the cabin for hours. When Samuel returned and found her there, he didn't speak. He just knelt beside her and held her while she cried. But eventually the tears stopped, and when they did, something else took their place. Something cold and hard and unbreakable. That evening, as the sun set and the temperature dropped, Ruth finally stood. She walked out of the cabin, across the quarters, and toward the main house. Samuel tried to follow her, but she told him to stay back. "Don't follow me," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made him stop. She didn't go to the front door. She went to the kitchen building, a separate structure connected to the main house by a covered walkway. Fire in the hearth was still burning. It was always kept lit during winter to make cooking easier in the mornings. Ruth stood there for a long time staring at the flames. She thought about Danina, her mother, who'd worked in this kitchen for 20 years before she died. She thought about all the meals she'd helped prepare. All the hours she'd spent standing at this hearth cooking food for people who saw her as nothing more than a tool. She thought about Lily, about her small hands and bright eyes, about the way she laughed when Samuel made the wooden animals dance, about the way she'd reached for Ruth that morning, her fingers grasping at air as Trent carried her away. And she thought about Edmund Harrove, about his cold eyes and his ledgers and his gold watch chain, about the way he'd said "you'll get over it," as if losing a child was no different than losing a tool or a piece of furniture. She reached down and picked up a burning log from the hearth. The heat seared her hands, but she didn't let go. She carried it through the covered walkway and into the main house. She went to the study first, the room where Harrove kept his ledgers, the room where he'd sat with Josiah Trent and negotiated the price of her daughter's life. She set the burning log on the desk on top of the open ledger. The paper caught fire immediately, the flames spreading quickly across the pages. She watched for a moment, watching the names burn, all those names, all those people who'd been bought and sold. reduced to entries in a ledger. Then she turned and walked out. She went to the parlor next, where Caroline Harrove kept her expensive furniture and her imported rugs. She set fire to the curtains, watching them go up in flames. Then the dining room, the sitting room, the hallway. By the time she reached the front door, the entire first floor was burning. She walked out into the cold night air and stood in the yard, watching the flames spread. She could hear shouting now, people running, someone screaming. But she didn't move. She just stood there, her hands blistered and bleeding, watching the house burn. The fire burned for hours, consuming not just wood and brick, but the illusion of order that men like Edmund Hargrove tried to impose on a system built on human suffering. By the time the first neighbors arrived, drawn by the glow visible for miles across the flat Piedmont landscape, there was nothing to be done. The main house was engulfed, flames shooting 30 feet into the air. The heat was so intense that people couldn't get within 50 yards of the structure. They formed a bucket line from the well anyway, more out of instinct than hope, passing water hand to hand in a futile attempt to contain the blaze. Edmund Hargrove and his family had escaped through a second-floor window on the east side of the house. Caroline had jumped first, landing badly and breaking her ankle. The two boys had been lowered down by their father, then caught by Bess, who'd been one of the first to see the flames. Harrove had been the last out, and by the time he hit the ground, his nightshirt was singed, and his face was blackened with smoke. They huddled together in the yard, wrapped in blankets someone had brought from the quarters, watching their home burn. William, the older boy, was crying. James, the younger one, just stared at the flames, his eyes wide and unblinking. Caroline was in shock, her broken ankle twisted at an unnatural angle, her face pale and sweating despite the cold. The enslaved people from the quarters had come running when they saw the fire. Some joined the bucket line. Others tried to save what they could from the outbuildings, including the smokehouse, the stables, and the tobacco barns. The kitchen building, connected to the main house by the covered walkway, caught fire around midnight and burned completely. One of the tobacco barns downwind from the main house caught sparks and was lost as well. By dawn, on December 26th, the main house was nothing but a smoking ruin. The walls had collapsed inward, leaving only the brick chimney standing, blackened and cracked. The iron gates at the entrance to the property had warped from the heat. Their decorative scrollwork melted and twisted. Ruth was found sitting on the ground near the remains of the house, her hands burned and blistered, her dress singed and torn. She didn't resist when Cyrus Dalton, the overseer, grabbed her by the arm and pulled her to her feet. She didn't say a word. Samuel tried to go to her, but Dalton shoved him back. "Stay where you are," he said. Ruth looked at Samuel once, just once. Her eyes were dry. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, and then she looked away. Dalton took her to the barn and locked her inside. The inquiry began 2 days later. The county sheriff, a man named Thomas Garrett, came to the estate with a deputy and a clerk to take statements. He interviewed Edmund Hargrove first, then Caroline, then several of the enslaved people who'd been present when the fire started. Hargrove's account was straightforward. He'd been asleep when the fire started. He'd woken to the smell of smoke and the sound of his wife screaming. He'd gotten his family out as quickly as he could. He believed the fire had been caused by a lantern left burning in the kitchen, or perhaps a spark from the hearth. But when pressed, he admitted that Ruth had been seen near the kitchen building shortly before the fire started. And when asked why she might have been there, he hesitated. "There was an incident earlier in the day," he said finally. "A child was sold. The child's mother was upset. Sheriff Garrett made a note in his ledger. Upset enough to set fire to your house." Hargrove didn't answer directly. "I don't know what she was thinking, but she was the last person seen near the kitchen before the fire started." The sheriff interviewed Ruth the next day. She was still in the barn, her hands wrapped in strips of cloth that Bess had brought her. She sat on the dirt floor, her back against the wall, staring at nothing. "Did you set the fire?" Garrett asked. Ruth didn't respond. "If you confess, it'll go easier for you," he said. "The judge might show leniency." Ruth looked at him. Her eyes were empty. "What will you do to me?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse from screaming the day before. "That's up to the judge," Garrett said. "Will you hang me?" Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "That's up to the judge," he said again. Ruth looked away. "Then it doesn't matter what I say." The inquiry concluded 3 days later. The official finding was inconclusive. There was no direct evidence that Ruth had set the fire, only circumstantial evidence and suspicion. But there was also no other explanation that made sense. Edmund Hargrove, despite everything, didn't push for a trial. Some said it was because he didn't want the attention. A trial would mean newspapers, questions, scrutiny. It would mean people asking why he'd sold a baby on Christmas morning. It would mean his business dealings, his debts, his ledgers all becoming public. Others said it was because he knew what a trial would reveal, that he'd sold a child for $200 in silver, that he'd torn a family apart to pay off a debt, that he'd done it on Christmas of all days. Whatever his reasons, he made a decision. Ruth would be sold quietly, quickly, to someone far enough away that the story wouldn't follow her. 3 weeks later, a broker from Charleston arrived at the estate. His name was Marcus Finch, and he specialized in what he called difficult cases, enslaved people who'd run away or fought back or caused trouble. He paid less than market value, but he paid cash and he didn't ask questions. He paid Edmund Hargrove $150 for Ruth, $50 less than Harrove had gotten for Lily. Ruth was taken away on a cold morning in late January. She didn't say goodbye to Samuel. She didn't look back at the quarters or the fields or the ruins of the main house. She just climbed into the back of Finch's wagon and sat down, her hands still bandaged, her face expressionless. Samuel watched her go. He stood in the yard outside their cabin, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just watched until the wagon disappeared down the road. That night, he went into the cabin and found the small wooden rabbit he'd carved for Lily. He held it in his hands for a long time, running his fingers over the smooth wood, remembering the way Lily had laughed when he made it hop across the table. Then he wrapped it in a piece of cloth and buried it beneath the floorboards in the corner where Lily's cradle had been. The years that followed were hard ones for the Harrove estate. Edmund Hargrove rebuilt, but it took time and money he didn't have. He borrowed from banks in Greensboro and Raleigh, putting up the land as collateral. He hired new workers to replace the ones he'd sold, but they were expensive, and the tobacco crops continued to be unpredictable. By 1860, the estate was barely breaking even. Harrove had built a new house, smaller and simpler than the original, with fewer rooms and no decorative details. It was functional, nothing more. He'd also rebuilt the kitchen as a separate structure, but this time he'd had it built farther from the main house with a stone foundation and a brick chimney that extended well above the roofline. He'd become obsessed with fire safety. Every door in the new house had a lock. Every window had shutters that could be barred from the inside. He kept buckets of water stationed at intervals around the property, and he'd had a bell installed near the main house that could be rung in case of emergency. He also kept a rifle by his bed, and he slept poorly. Caroline never fully recovered from the fire. Her ankle healed badly, leaving her with a permanent limp, but the physical injury was nothing compared to the psychological one. She developed an intense anxiety about fire that bordered on obsession. She refused to allow candles in the house, insisting that only oil lamps be used, and even then only in rooms where someone was present. She wouldn't let the boys play near the hearth. She had nightmares, waking in the middle of the night screaming that she smelled smoke. By 1861, she'd stopped leaving the house entirely. She spent her days in the upstairs bedroom reading the same books over and over, writing letters to her sisters that she never sent. She rarely spoke to Edmund, and when she did, it was only to ask about the locks on the doors or the water in the buckets. The boys grew up in the shadow of the fire. William, the older one, became quiet and withdrawn. He'd wake in the night sometimes crying, saying he dreamed about the flames. James, the younger one, developed a stutter that he never fully outgrew. The enslaved people on the estate spoke about the fire in whispers. They didn't talk about it openly, not where Harrove or Dalton could hear, but among themselves they told the story about Ruth and Lily, about Christmas morning, about the way Ruth had walked into the main house with a burning log in her hands. Some said she'd been right to do it, that Harrove had deserved to lose his house, his wealth, his sense of security, that he'd taken something from her that could never be replaced, and she'd taken something from him in return. Others said it had been a mistake, that Ruth had only made things worse for herself and for everyone else, that the fire had accomplished nothing except to bring more suffering. But everyone agreed on one thing. Ruth had made a choice. She decided that if she couldn't have her daughter, Edmund Harrove wouldn't have his house. Samuel never spoke about Ruth after she was taken away. He worked in the tobacco barns the same as before, but he was quieter now. He didn't carve anymore. He didn't sing. He kept to himself, and people learned not to ask him questions. In the spring of 1861, when the war started, several of the younger men on the estate tried to run away, hoping to reach Union lines. 2 of them made it. 3 were caught and brought back. Samuel didn't try to run. He just kept working day after day, his face expressionless, his hands moving through the familiar motions of stripping tobacco leaves and hanging them to dry. In 1863, Cyrus Dalton, the overseer, was conscripted into the Confederate Army. He was killed at Gettysburg in July of that year. Edmund Hargrove tried to manage the estate himself after that, but he was overwhelmed. The tobacco crops failed 2 years in a row. The workers, sensing that the war might bring changes, became less cooperative. Some simply stopped working, daring Hargrove to do something about it. By 1865, when the war ended, the estate was in ruins. The fields were overgrown, the barns were falling apart. The new house, only 5 years old, already looked worn and neglected. When the Emancipation Proclamation reached North Carolina, Samuel was one of the first to leave. He walked off the estate on a warm morning in May, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the small wooden rabbit he dug up from beneath the floorboards of his cabin. He walked north, following the roads toward Virginia. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't have a plan. He just knew he couldn't stay. He never found Lily. He tried. He asked everyone he met if they'd heard of a light-skinned girl, about 8 years old by then, who might have been sold in Richmond in 1858. But nobody knew anything. The records had been destroyed in the war. The traders were dead or scattered. The trail was cold. He settled eventually in a small town in southern Virginia, working as a carpenter. He never married again. He never had other children. He kept the wooden rabbit on a shelf in his room, and sometimes late at night he'd take it down and hold it, remembering. He died in 1891, at the age of 63. He was buried in a small cemetery outside the town in an unmarked grave. Edmund Hargrove held on to the estate until 1871. If you found this story as powerful as I did, please subscribe to my channel for more forgotten chapters of history that need to be remembered.